Book of the Bible series. It's a topical approach, more thematic approach. And so, what is today? April the 12th. This will take us through the third week of May, 6 weeks through May 17. And it looks like our summer study, whatever that may be, we're still working on that, will start May 24th, I believe. And probably will take us through at least July. In other words, I think we're going to turn classes loose on their own, basically the last week or so of May, June, and July. If you have, if you have ideas, one of the ideas that we talked about was doing some word studies. You mind me sharing? So Naoma suggested this, and then I kind of took it and ran with it and have gotten some ideas already working with Rodney Ashlock. I know he's at least going to fill in for a couple weeks at the end of May and first part of June. Naoma has some ideas for some words, and I think that may be a great approach because I don't know how mobile this class will be over the summer. People tend to get mobile in the summer, and they're here a week, they're gone a week, they're out for 2, they're back for 1, they're somewhere else, and so if you're trying to do a series, you lose continuity. Yeah.
I was just going to say, we're getting a little old to be mobile.
Yeah, let's say, how mobile, maybe the mobility is not so much an issue for us. Well, part of that is we'll be more mobile this summer, and so Rodney has agreed to teach a little bit at the end of May and 1st of June, and not that I don't want to. We're not going to be anywhere. We'll be here, but that's the week or 2 or 3 preceding and around the wedding, and not that I don't want to, but we'll have. It will be I think it'll be a nice change of pace. Then in July, Laura and I for 2 weeks, 2 Sundays, we'll be in Argentina taking a high school group to go see the Pratos. And so that will be 2 Sundays worth, 10 days. And that's going to take care of 2 weeks in the middle of July. So I'm not quite sure how we'll do class, but we'll figure it out. Naoma suggests worship, covenant, aroma, sanctuary, baptism, angels, and spirit/soul. Those are some words that show up in the New Testament, not just New Testament, Old Testament.
Especially aroma.
The aroma of Christ, yeah.
Also with that is sweet aroma.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
And I wonder what would be a sweet aroma to God today for us.
Yeah. So let that prime the pump, get you thinking. What are some words? And if you do 1 word a week, you don't have to worry about missing a week and missing the continuity and the flow of things. Okay? So Rodney and I have already talked about this, and I'm going to have to rope either Rodney back in or rope some other folks in to help. And so if you have other ideas along these lines, we're all ears. Okay, having said that, for today and the next 5 weeks, Lord willing, Christ and culture in the New Testament. Okay? Now, this is the curriculum. James wrote the curriculum, and it's a condensation off I think this is his latest book, Christ and Culture in the New Testament. And I'm reading it. This came out a couple years ago in 2023. And I'm reading through it as we're going through this. This is an excellent approach. his basic approach is, what does the New Testament writers, what do the New Testament writers, how do they engage this question, or you want to think of it as a problem, how do they think through the implications of relating or navigating through your culture. It's not super technical, but it will require your close attention, okay? And it's not impossible. If you want the fuller version, I'd say grab a hold of James, okay, get his book here. It's typical James in that it is clear and he's got an eye on the implications for the church, for the local, for a group of us, okay?
His book on Hebrews is very scholarly.
Indeed it is. This does not assume quite so much, what I've seen so far. I think you may want to look at, just to consider, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to spend about 6 weeks, today kind of an introduction, a week apiece for Jesus and culture. So the place to begin when you're thinking about this from the perspective of the writers of the New Testament, well, Jesus and culture, Christ and culture in Corinth, and then he picks up this phrase, our citizenship is in heaven. So it's kind of almost like another word study there, this idea of our citizenship is in heaven. Okay, so a week on that. Aliens and exiles in 1 Peter. Again, another similar analysis. You're aliens and exiles. If you read through 1 Peter, that motif or that image or that language is very prominent. And then last, the church and the world in John's writings, the writings of John. So we're going to get Jesus through the evangelists, through the gospel writers, Paul, Peter, and John. What do they have to say about this question or problem or opportunity? You could think of it in different ways. You could think of it as the problem of Christ and culture, or you could think of it as the opportunity of the church. What does the New Testament say about this? Okay, so this is a break from an exegetical kind of study where we're trying to unfold the meaning of a book from beginning to end, like we did with Exodus, like we did most recently with Micah. Kind of enter into the world of a book and stay there and go all the way through. Maybe we don't mention every verse as we go through class, but we go all the way through. Well, this is different, but I think it's going to be very helpful. Just what I've looked at so far, I'm certainly learning something, and so I'm excited. Okay, today, I want to think a bit, let's do 3 or 4 things. One, I want to think a bit about kind of the basic Christian confession. And that which is kind of going to be a presupposition for us. In other words, we're going to assume that this is going to be our starting point that's going to guide us all the way through. A presupposition. We're going to take something for granted. We're going to make a claim at the beginning, and that's kind of going to filter everything. Okay? Alongside that, that's kind of 1A, and 1B is kind of just to make an observation. A historical observation and kind of say, aha, something in the past has happened. Okay? Now, that's kind of the first thing. Then I want to try to define culture. Okay? Christ and culture in the New Testament. Okay? Christ I'm familiar with. What do you mean by culture? Okay, that's a good question. Well, that's the second thing to do today, is kind of think through, well, when we say culture, what do we mean? Okay, that's the second thing. The third is briefly think out loud about how we might think about this question or problem or opportunity um, today. Okay? And that's going to set us up for these analyses of the New Testament. Jesus, Paul in Corinth, Paul in the language of citizenship, Peter and John. Okay. All of that in 22 minutes. Good luck, yes. All right, so if you're watching online, good morning and good luck, all right? Okay. By the way, if you're joining us online now or later, James's book is published by Cascade Books in Eugene, Oregon. So everyone here in the room can look at this. Those of you, wherever you are, you can't look at this, but you can find it. James Thompson, Christ and Culture in the New Testament. I should say, everyone here knows, if you're at home and you're a member of the church, you already know, but if you're just from wherever and you don't, James is one of our elders, and he has written a lot over his career. This is the latest one, and he has worked on the curriculum guide that helps our teachers. All right, me being one of them. And I appreciate this because I feel very comfortable saying, just dropping me in the middle of Mike and saying, all right, go for it. I need the kind of help that James gives the teachers when we do topical studies like this. Okay. I think the place to begin, and in some ways this is where James begins, is Christians confess Jesus Christ is Lord. Your basic confession. I don't know when you made yours. I don't know where you made it. I don't know what age you were or the circumstances that led you to it, but I feel very confident that your confession and my confession and hers and his and back there and all the rest of us, whenever we all get here, the one thing that we all share is we have made a common confession at our baptism: Jesus Christ is Lord. All of us. And that one confession orients everything about our faith and our life. I know we don't often always live up to that confession, but that's something else. We still have made the confession. And that is the core of our faith. Everything kind of stems from that we believe that Jesus Christ crucified is the way to encounter the God, maker of heaven and earth. When we make that confession, that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and none would come to the Father except through him, when we make that confession, we have already set ourselves at odds to any who would make or claim another confession or allegiance, or make another higher demand upon us. In other words, sometimes we find ourselves in a fight we didn't pick. Okay? When we make that confession, and it has some downstream implications. For example, Christ crucified, stumbling block, an offense, a scandal, folly, foolishness. The New Testament, Paul talks about the scandal of the cross. When we make that kind of confession, it has some implications. Okay. How do we live out that confession? In many different places and many different circumstances. Well, that's whoop. Bless you. Yep. Yep. A lot of sneezing. You have to feel better after that. Well, wherever we happen to be, we're going to address the necessities of living out that confession in some way, kind of in a way that's compelling in our circumstance, and in a way that helps us navigate the hostilities or the questions or the skepticism or the doubt or the critique, or in some ways the ways that our cultural surroundings are hospitable to that confession, or may want to co-opt it or take advantage of it. Okay? In other words, it's kind of slippery, kind of messy. How are we going to have to live out that confession? Well, in some ways, it's kind of always been that way. But James's basic starting point, I think, is very helpful, is when we make that confession, at some level, we automatically are then at odds with our surrounding kind of milieu or circumstances. For lack of a better term, what one word could we use? Culture. We're already kind of at odds with our culture. Okay? Or at least some parts of it. Well, another observation, just kind of something to take note of. Something that has happened that has some implications for us. Okay. Did any of you sit in Lemoyne Lewis's church history class? I think it happened here on Wednesday nights for about 15 years. Remember that? In the late 70s? Okay. As I understand it, someone said, Lemoyne, we'd like for you to teach church history on Wednesday nights. And as it was told to me, he says, I would love to do that under one condition. I can teach it how I think it ought to be taught for as long as I need to teach it. Also, I'm kind of out of town speaking at other places, so I may not be able to be there every week. And I think they were hard up for Wednesday night teachers. And they said, okay, that'd be great. Whenever you can, you kind of do this, and we're not going to give a timeline for you. And he then took 13 years, or 12, and taught through 2,000 years of church history, on average about 40 years per class. Now, I don't think he really said, now today we'll start at the year 1430 and get to 1470. Next week we'll pick up at 1470. But it averages out to 13 years worth of classes, not every Wednesday night, but most, about 40 years of time covered. Okay. Were you in his freshman Bible class? That's too long ago. I've been told he loved to teach freshmen. And in some ways, when other folks were trying to get away from the freshmen and teach the upper class, he goes, no, I want to teach the freshmen. I also have been told that he was very engaging, and it was like you were there. When he taught church history, you were there. Okay, so with a nod to Lemoyne, there was a major shift that happened in the history of the church when the powers that be in Rome, who were hostile to the Christian faith, were then friendly to the Christian faith. A night and day difference. In other words, the experience of the writers of the New Testament and the Christians for the first 250 years-ish or so lived in a culture, a web of meaning making, of how people made sense of their lives that basically was hostile and in some ways officially, legally, politically hostile towards that Christian confession until the Emperor Constantine becomes a Christian and then not only tolerates it, about 313 AD, the Edict of Milan, or the Edict of Toleration. He tolerates Christians and then becomes one and sanctions it as the official religion of the empire, and all of the power of the global worldwide empire that is the Roman Empire, it comes behind the Christian confession in support of it, which is a huge shift. The Constantinian shift. Emperor Constantine becomes a Christian, and the faith that those who confessed it, in other words, could you imagine living in the 330s AD and the way that you lived and navigated your faith for your grandparents risked their very lives. And you have lived to see the day when those who persecuted and killed your grandparents, you see them officially propagating that faith. That's a total shift, okay? Now, we all remember, and I'm trying to get now to the second thing, to the definition of culture. We all remember kind of the way things were in the United States a generation ago, let's say 40 years ago, and we think, boy, it's a little different now than it was then, okay? It feels like another kind of shift. Not quite the same magnitude or scope as the Constantinian shift, but you can think, yeah, it's not quite the way it was. In other words, and I know that every generation says that. We've all said that. Every generation has always said, it's just not as good as it used to be, okay? I was reading in some church papers in the 1920s, and some folks in the 1920s said, it's not as good as it used to be 40 years ago. Okay, well, there's people who said it needs to be like it was in the 1920s. Meanwhile, there's people in the 1920s saying, it's terrible. It used to be great, it's terrible. And now another generation says, well, if we could just go back to the time when our great-grandparents said it was terrible, it would be great. Like, okay, we've always done that. Sometimes you'll hear this word Christendom. The age of Christendom, that is when the Christian faith has the support of the powers of the state. Sometime, and again, in the United States, when we do not have the establishment of religion as an official religion on the part of the state. Disestablishment of religion. Kind of hard for us to understand kind of what our several greats would have experienced in Europe prior to the American Revolution, when there was state-sanctioned, state-sponsored embodiment of the Christian faith with all of the political force that comes behind supporting it. In a liberal democracy such as the United States, it's kind of hard for us to understand that. Okay, so when folks talk about Christendom, you're thinking about 1800 years of the power of the state behind the Christian confession. And we can say, yeah, it's not like that anymore. Okay? It's not like that anymore. Okay? So, in other words, and James makes this point, we're living in an increasingly post-Christian world. What we mean by that is the general scaffolding of the broad culture, including the political entities, no longer take that Christian confession for granted and support it. In fact, they're either ambivalent or hostile to it. In other words, we don't care about your faith. It will not have any meaningful impact on public life or national or civic policy, and we're certainly not going to enforce those beliefs on folks who do not also otherwise ascribe to them. And we're not going to make civic policy or kind of broad cultural assumptions that that's the way things ought to be. In other words, we're living more and more in a world that does not take those things for granted, whereas our immediate near ancestors would have lived in a world and a culture that took those things for granted. Which means we have a lot more in common with the folks of the New Testament who were on the outside than we formerly did. Okay, which now that gets me to the question, what is culture? Okay, James makes an observation, and he says there is no single word in the New Testament that kind of comes across into English as culture. But the situation that the folks in the first century lived in, that they were called out from, kind of relates to culture. So when we talk about things of the world versus things of the faith. You are not of this world, the way things are in this present age. We do not see things according to the flesh. Paul's talking about kind of what we would call the way things are in the world or culture. When Paul can talk about those who are believers and unbelievers, when Paul can talk about be careful how you live among those on the outside, he's talking about the cultural situation, the way things are, and we're just not, it's kind of like a set of clothes and we just don't quite fit in that circumstance. We're in it, but we're not of it, okay? So it's not like there's this single word that we can then transfer into English and define it. We have to kind of come at it from a couple angles. Okay, so that doesn't help. So what is it? Good question. How can I do that in two minutes? Well, I don't know that I can, and this is where I have to rely on other people's expertise, because this is not my area of expertise. Think of all of the things that help us make sense of the way things are and the way we want them to be. This is my effort to kind of define culture. Let me give you an example. We moved from Tennessee out here 13 years ago. We went back home. They said, "How is it in Texas?" And I said, "Well, the people are nice, but they have strange ways out there." It rains last night, and I get homesick. Why? Because the way things are out here means you could go years without hearing rain. And when you hear rain for more than just a downburst, all of a sudden it was kind of like a flood of emotions and memories of, Tennessee, and all that goes with it. There's a guy that I follow on Facebook, and he has the Appalachian word of the day. And he comes on and he says, "Now, I don't know about you, but growing up in the hills of eastern Kentucky, we always used to say this. Now, you let me know if you've ever heard this before." And he'll say something like this. Or Dan McGregor and I will sometimes talk about things that I have heard from my Appalachian roots that he says I've never heard of out here in Texas. For example, cat head biscuits. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Some of you are looking at me like, what? A cat head biscuit? Never heard of that. It's a biscuit, and it's just as big as a cat's head. That's all it is. And you think, that's the strangest thing. A cat head, it's not made of a cat's head. It's nothing like that. Heard that. So you think about the ways we live in the world, touches on even the land and how we interact with our world, which is why when it rains, it can trigger memories of home in me. And some of you think, that doesn't mean anything to me. Food, culture, habits, food, language, habits, how we interact with the land, how we interact with each other, how we organize our civic life, how we organize recreation and leisure, what we think is important and how we transfer that importance to others, how we define what's honorable, what's shameful, what's admirable, what's forbidden, what laws do we have? For example, in Hendersonville, Tennessee, and even into the mid-1980s, if you wanted gas, there were about 2 places to go to get gas. Otherwise, you had to drive in towards Nashville to get gas on a Sunday because the gas stations were closed on Sunday. You could go to Kroger, and they would be open on Sunday, but Hill's grocery store closed on Sundays. Now, the restaurants started to open by lunch on Sunday because we all, no one's a fool. It meant First Baptist early service got out by 10:30. and they were hungry, and they had a $20 bill in their pocket, so there's going to be plenty of restaurants to open for Sunday lunch. So the restaurants weren't closed, but shopping, frequently the stores would be closed on Sunday. Okay, that world is gone, 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 ain't never coming back, right? Today, we see Chick-fil-A and we think, that's an odd thing, isn't it? Some of us remember, oh, there was lots that was closed on Sunday. Sometimes by law. We talk about the blue laws. So what gives us meaning and we hold to be important that finds itself codified into the legal, in other words, this is the way things are, and if you break this law, we'll fine you or put you in jail, okay? Kind of is part of the web of culture. It's the traditions and the meaning behind the traditions. All right, here's another example. For example, I have not really dug into this very deeply, but I think the tradition of the national anthem before sporting events, I think that happens during World War II. Because here's what I think I've heard a little bit about this, but I'm not, so I'm willing to be corrected and willing to be wrong. Places where civic assemblies happen in times of acute national crisis like the war, it's a way for us to express our unity and our solidarity with each other. And so when we come together, we remember where we are and what's going on. We remember our boys, right? And so the playing of the national anthem as a kind of a solemn moment of unity and expression of our ideals. Also, at those same high school sporting events, you could have a prayer. Okay? Well, I think all of you remember a day when a prayer by the public school officials at a public school event, no one bats an eye, and I think that's just how it is here. That's not the case anymore. Okay, so, and what we've seen in the last probably 20 years of some who would take exception to the playing of the national anthem at sporting events. Again, all that to say is we see a clash of cultures. We see competing visions of what we all hold important and why. All that's to get us thinking about what makes culture, culture. Okay, it's not necessarily the high culture of, classical music and, sitting in a high back chair with your ascot, reading literature, reading Shakespeare. Okay. There's always all different kinds of culture. Yes?
I don't know if people saw the news the last week or two, but they're thinking to have some kind of biblical classes in school, public school now.
Yes.
I don't know
Well,
where it's going.
the different places, a fight is a good way to describe it. A good fight about, is it appropriate to have the Ten Commandments in a public space? That is a cultural, that is a window into a changed cultural landscape. Time was, most folks took it for granted, and you're like, put the Ten Commandments on the courthouse lawn? Well, why would we do that? All of us believe in the Ten Commandments. Except when some of us don't, and some of us wish we all did. So you can see then, so there's the issue. Okay?
I think
Yes.
Oklahoma passed a law that said that the Ten Commandments had to be displayed somewhere in every school.
Yes.
I'm not sure that's correct, but it seems like I've heard that.
So a state-sponsored implementation of a display of religious principles. Just observe, that's a new thing, or at least newer, and how that happened, why that happened, who wants that to happen, who doesn't want that to happen, and why? What kind of meaning does that symbol carry? Those are all getting at definitions of culture. Okay? Folks have tried to, again, you could think of it as a problem, you could think of it as an opportunity. They've tried to kind of thread this needle in a couple of ways. One is to think of Christ against culture. And another kind of pole is to think the Christ of culture. One way to think about this and navigate this is separation. Radical separation from the culture. In extreme forms, Amish or Mennonite, even in how we approach the use of technology and dress. Another is the Christ of culture, which kind of the best of human society aligns easily with the Christian confession. In other words, very little critique with the Christ of culture, a whole lot of critique of Christ against culture, and then James sketches out, some folks have suggested, some middle positions about how we navigate that. Question for us, and for James's curriculum, is what do the New Testament writers say about that? Well, next week, Jesus, then a couple weeks on Paul in Corinth, this language of our citizenship is in heaven, a week with Peter, and a week with John. And that takes us through 6 weeks. Give you something to chew on, think about. Okay, I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to it. It's a different kind of tack. All right, so we're going to pause with a go through the book study and do this for 6 weeks. If you have ideas for great words that you'd like for us to study, I'm happy to tackle them, or I can also pass them off to Rodney or whoever else I can rope in to help with those couple weeks in July. We'll do that. I don't know if I wasn't quite sure when the Argentina trip was going to happen, so I don't know if we'll be able to do crucifixion study or not. We talked about that. I really would like to. We'll see. All right? Well, we'll call it a good place to stop for today, and we'll pick up there next week.